March 6, 1943, 10 Sabr a.m., Jebel Quif, Algeria. The headquarters of the United States II Corps was a portrait of despair. The desert wind blew fine, choking dust over torn tents and lines of men with disheveled uniforms. Many were not wearing their steel helmets. Some walked around without shirts, their rifles leaning casually against supply crates. When the air raid siren began to wail, announcing the approach of German Messerschmitt fighters, the men did not run for the trenches. They walked. With an apathy born of absolute defeat, they shuffled toward the shelters, looking up at the sky with a fatalistic resignation. At that exact moment, a convoy of armored jeeps with blaring sirens tore through the center of the camp. From the lead vehicle, flanked by gleaming general stars and polished armor plate, stepped a figure who looked like he belonged to a completely different war. He wore perfectly shined cavalry boots, immaculate tailored riding breeches, a gleaming steel helmet, and two ivory-handled revolvers on his hips. It was Major General George S. Patton. He didn't look up at the sky. He didn't seek the safety of a bunker. He stood perfectly still in the center of the compound, his eyes locked on the American soldiers who were shuffling like beaten civilians. The fury on his face was cold, calculated, and absolute. What the soldiers of the Disastrous Corps didn't know was that their war of complacency had ended the second those boots hit the sand. They thought the Battle of Kasserine Pass had been the worst moment of their lives. They believed the Germans were the most terrifying force in North Africa. What they were about to discover was that the man with the ivory revolvers was going to be far more terrifying than any panzer division. Patton had not been sent to Africa to comfort them for their losses. He had been sent to purge them. To understand the sheer brutality of the 10 days that followed, you have to understand the colossal humiliation that required such a response. Just 2 weeks earlier, the United States Army had suffered the most embarrassing military defeat in its modern history at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It was the first major engagement between American ground forces and the war machine of Nazi Germany. The American public, fed on propaganda and easy victories against demoralized Vichy French troops during Operation Torch a few months prior, expected their boys to sweep across the desert sands and push the fascists into the sea. In Washington, politicians spoke of the American industrial might that would effortlessly crush the enemy. In reality, the Africa Corps, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, sliced through the American lines like a scalpel cutting through diseased tissue. The Americans weren't just defeated, they were gutted. The armored units were fed into the battle piecemeal, destroyed one by the deadly German 80mm anti-aircraft guns, which had been leveled horizontally to slaughter tanks. The American M3 Lee and Sherman tanks were outmaneuvered and left burning in the desert valleys. The infantry, poorly trained and badly positioned, broke and ran. Men abandoned their heavy equipment, their artillery pieces, their rifles, and sprinted for miles to the rear, completely overcome by panic. In a matter of days, the United States suffered over 6,000 casualties and lost hundreds of tanks. The myth of American invincibility was crushed beneath the tracks of the German panzers. The culprit for this catastrophe was not a lack of courage on the part of the common soldier. The boys from farms in Ohio and factories in Detroit fought as hard as they could. The culprit wore the command stars of the Disastrous Corps, Major General Lloyd Fredendall. Fredendall was a tactical disaster and a managerial coward. While his men were fighting, bleeding, and dying in the freezing rain and mud of the Kasserine Pass, Fredendall was over 70 miles away from the front lines. He was paralyzed by a profound obsession with his own personal safety. He had ordered an entire company of combat engineers to stop building defensive fortifications for the infantry, and instead blast a massive underground bunker complex for himself into the side of a ravine he nicknamed Speedy Valley. He rarely visited the front lines. He refused to look his subordinate commanders in the eye. Instead, he issued orders over the radio, using a bizarre, cryptic slang that he had invented himself, calling infantry units walking boys and artillery pop guns. His own officers couldn't decipher what he was telling them to do. He divided his forces, ignored intelligence warnings, and allowed his units to be isolated and destroyed. When the defeat finally happened, Fredendall's fatal flaw was fully exposed to the world. He blamed the British, he blamed the French, he blamed the weather, the intelligence officers, and the equipment. He blamed his own division commanders. He blamed everyone and everything except himself. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, read the after-action reports from Kasserine and realized a terrifying truth. The primary problem was not German strategic superiority. The problem was American culture. The II Corps was infected by a disease of victimization, sloppiness, and a lack of accountability. Eisenhower knew that there was only one antidote for this specific disease in the entire American arsenal. He fired Fredendall, stripped him of his command, and made the phone call to George S. Patton. When Patton assumed command on March 6th, the transformation was not a gradual shift in policy. It was a seismic shock to the system. Patton's diagnosis of the Second Corps was surgical and immediate. He observed that a lack of discipline on the battlefield begins with a lack of discipline in the camp. A man who lacks the basic discipline to button his own uniform, or the courage to demand that his subordinates do so, will never possess the discipline to hold a defensive position under heavy machine gun fire. If an army tolerates sloppiness in the rear, it will guarantee slaughter at the front. Therefore, Patton's very first order was not a complex tactical maneuver regarding tank deployment or artillery flanking. It was General Order Number 47. The order demanded that all soldiers and officers at all times wear their heavy steel helmets, laced canvas leggings, and neckties. They were to be in full regulation uniform 24 hours a day. This applied to everyone. It applied to mechanics covered in grease-repairing tank engines in the motor pool. It applied to cooks preparing meals miles away from the front lines. It applied to medics operating in surgical tents. Anyone caught without their helmet or with unpolished brass would be fined $25 on the spot. In 1943, $25 was the equivalent of nearly a month's pay for a combat private. It was an astronomical, crippling fine. The reaction from the troops was one of absolute outrage. The officers complained bitterly to the press. The enlisted men muttered about mutiny in the mess tents. They had just survived a massacre. They had lost their friends in the desert, and now they were being financially punished for not having their boots properly shined. They viewed Patton as a lunatic obsessed with appearances, a military peacock who didn't understand the grim, dirty realities of combat in the North African theater. They called him blood and guts, and the dark joke in the trenches quickly became, yeah, our blood and his guts. The irony was brutal. The men thought Patton didn't understand the reality of war. The truth was that Patton was the only man in North Africa who understood exactly what the psychology of war required. Patton explained his philosophy in his private diary with a ruthless, flawless logic. If you can't make a soldier wear his helmet when he is not under fire, how are you going to make him advance against a machine gun when he is? Discipline to Patton had absolutely nothing to do with aesthetics. It was entirely about reflex. When a man is under a sustained artillery barrage, the conscious brain shuts down. Fear paralyzes the nervous system. In that moment of sheer terror, muscle memory and reflexive obedience are the only things that prevent panic from taking control. Patton was actively installing a psychological control system. He needed the men to fear the wrath of their commanding officer more than they feared the German artillery. If they were terrified of breaking a minor uniform regulation, they would be terrified of disobeying a direct combat order. But the uniform fines for the enlisted men were merely the visible facade of the true purge. Patton's primary target was not the infantry. His target was the officer corps. In his first 10 days in command, Patton initiated the most ruthless and sweeping purge of commanding officers in the modern history of the U.S. Army. He was entirely uninterested in excuses. He did not want to hear about blocked supply routes, fatigue, or the superiority of German armor. He called meetings with his division, regimental, and battalion commanders. He walked up and down the lines, staring directly into the eyes of colonels and brigadier generals. Any officer who showed the slightest hesitation, any commander who attempted to explain why a specific objective could not be achieved, was fired on the spot. Patton's sole metric for leadership was what he called the killer instinct. During one infamous incident in the command tent, he ordered a regimental commander to take a heavily defended hill held by German infantry. The officer hesitated, looking at the map, and began to explain that the German defenses were heavily fortified, the terrain was bad, and the American casualties would likely be unacceptably high. Patton interrupted him. his voice dropping to a freezing whisper. "Take that hill, and do not come back alive unless you have it." Dozens of battalion commanders, supply officers, and intelligence chiefs were summarily relieved of their commands, stripped of their authority, and sent back to the United States in absolute disgrace. Patton ripped the weeds out by the roots. He dismantled Fredendall's old staff entirely. To replace them, he brought in men who understood that impossible was a word that would result in a court-martial. He brought in Major General Omar Bradley to serve as his deputy, a quiet, calculating tactician, known for his lethal competence and zero tolerance for failure. The message echoed down the chain of command like a thunderclap. The officer who did not lead from the front would be fired. The sergeant who did not enforce discipline would be demoted. The tolerance for failure dropped to absolute zero. The men continued to hate Patton, but something strange and undeniable began to happen in the second week of the Purge. The camp began to function. The broken vehicles in the motor pool were suddenly repaired. The rifles were spotless. The supply lines untangled, and hot food arrived on time. The night patrols went out with lethal precision and returned with actual, actionable intelligence. The hatred for Patton was unifying the Second Corps. By giving the men a common enemy inside their own headquarters, Patton made them forget the trauma they had suffered at Kasserine Pass. He reignited their pride by stoking their anger. They stopped feeling like victims of Rommel and started feeling like soldiers of Patton. The true bloody test of this brutal psychological engineering occurred on March 17, 1943, just 11 days after Patton assumed command. The Battle of El Guitar. Patton had ordered the 2I Corps to advance eastward, seizing the oasis town of Gafsa and pushing aggressively toward the valley of El Guitar. This American advance seriously threatened the rear echelons of the Axis forces holding the Mareth Line. Erwin Rommel and his replacement, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, decided it was time to give the Americans another bloody lesson. They dispatched the 10th Panzer Division, an elite battle-hardened unit of German veterans, supported by elements of the 21st Panzer Division, to crush the American advance and send them running back to the Algerian border. The Germans advanced with the absolute confidence born of Kasserine. They expected to find the same confused, terrified, poorly coordinated Americans they had slaughtered a month prior. They expected the infantry to break and run at the first sight of the panzer engines. They expected the artillery to fire wildly and ineffectively. What the Germans didn't know was that the 2I Corps no longer belonged to Lloyd Fredendall. The 2I Corps now belonged to George S. Patton. On the morning of March 23rd, more than 50 German tanks and thousands of mechanized infantrymen surged through the valley toward the American positions at El Guitar. It was a textbook, terrifying assault of the Blitzkrieg, but this time the Americans did not run. The 1st Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Terry Allen, one of the few commanders Patton had explicitly not fired because he recognized the man possessed the killer instinct, was heavily entrenched in the hills overlooking the valley. Every single soldier was wearing his steel helmet. Every officer was on the front line, communicating via field telephone, not hiding in a bunker 70 miles away. They knew that retreating without explicit orders didn't just mean losing the battle. It meant facing the wrath of their commanding general. The Germans pushed deep into the valley, waiting for the American lines to collapse. And then, the skies tore open. The American artillery, which had been completely reorganized and rigidly disciplined over the past 10 days, unleashed a synchronized hell on Earth. They employed a relatively new tactic called time on target, TOT. Instead of individual batteries firing sporadically, every artillery piece in the sector was mathematically calibrated to fire at different trajectories, so that hundreds of explosive shells would land on the exact same German position at the exact same split second. The explosions detonated in the air, raining razor-sharp shrapnel down upon the unprotected German infantry. The American anti-tank guns, perfectly camouflaged and holding their fire until the last possible second, ripped through the armor of the advancing panzers. The valley of El Guitar was instantly transformed into a slaughterhouse. The German assault stalled. They attempted to retreat, regroup under the cover of smoke, and launch a second massive attack in the late afternoon. Once again, they hit an impenetrable wall of American steel. The American officers did not panic. They held the line, adjusted the firing coordinates, and watched with grim satisfaction as the German armored units burned in the desert. By the end of the day, the once invincible Africa Corps was forced to withdraw, leaving dozens of smoking tanks and hundreds of dead soldiers in the valley. It was the first clear, undeniable tactical victory for the United States ground forces against Germany in the Second World War. In less than 2 weeks, the Nikkei Corps had gone from absolute humiliation to strategic triumph, and the difference was not new weapons, better tanks, or air superiority. The only difference was the brutal, unyielding purge of complacency. History frequently judges commanders like Patton with a comfortable academic detachment. Modern scholars focus on his deep personality flaws, his monstrous ego, and his undeniable insensitivity. Many look back at his system of financial fines, his screaming fits, and his mass firings, and label him a tyrant. They point to the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily months later as proof that his methods were inherently toxic. But the deep dive into military reality reveals a truth that is terrifyingly uncomfortable for modern sensibilities. In peacetime, the ideal leader is one who builds consensus, fosters collaboration, and cares deeply about the emotional well-being of his subordinates. Fredendall tried to be a manager at Kasserine, prioritizing comfort, especially his own, and actively avoiding the friction of severe discipline. The ultimate result of that soft leadership was the blood of thousands of young American boys soaking into the sand because they had not been taught how to survive. Patton understood that combat is an environment that forgives absolutely everything, except weakness. The brutal purge of the 10 days proved that, in the unforgiving math of war, rigid discipline is actually the deepest form of mercy, demanding that a terrified soldier dig a foxhole 2 feet deeper, demanding that an officer stand up under fire to lead his men, and enforcing the wearing of heavy helmets in the blistering desert heat seems like pointless cruelty in the moment. But it is the only thing that guarantees those men will live to see their families again. The officers that Patton fired had their careers ruined. Their reputations were destroyed. They were sent home as total failures. Patton did not feel a single ounce of pity for them, and history shouldn't either. They had failed the supreme test of military responsibility. They had placed their own comfort and their own excuses above the lives of the soldiers entrusted to their care. Patton amputated the cancer of mediocrity from the command structure before it could metastasize and kill more Americans. The lesson of Kasserine Pass and the Purge of El Guetar is not a celebration of war. It is a terrifying examination of the responsibility of power. Complacency kills far more soldiers than enemy ammunition ever could. When George S. Patton tore through that dusty camp, he did not want to be loved. He knew that true leadership is never a popularity contest. He willingly accepted the burning hatred of the Second Corps because he knew that very hatred would forge the psychological armor they needed to survive. He traded popularity for effectiveness, and he traded kindness for victory. By firing dozens of commanders in 10 days, Patton didn't just fix a broken army. He forged the unbreakable core of the military machine that would eventually land on the beaches of Normandy, liberate the continent of Europe, and totally destroy the Third Reich. In the merciless desert of Algeria, the most hated general in the American army taught his men the hardest lesson of all. The only way to survive hell is to march straight through it with your helmet buckled, your weapon loaded, and the absolute conviction that defeat is not an option. And in the lethal world of the Cold War and the global conflicts that would follow, the ghost of that 10-day purge would serve as the ultimate reminder that armies do not win because of the machines they operate, but because of the ruthless, unyielding discipline of the men who lead them.